The storm had not yet come, but it was coming. And in the last amber light of a fading summer, a woman stood at the edge of a small, forgotten plot of land and looked at what she had been given, if given was even the right word for it. Her name was Ilara Voss. She was 38 years old. She had a son, a grief she had not yet found the bottom of, and exactly 41 cents in the pocket of her worn cotton dress. Behind her, the town went on with its business. Doors closed, curtains shifted. No one waved. No one had waved in weeks. But before we understand where she stood, we must understand where she had been. Because the story of that door, and of the warmth behind it, and of the man who would one night come begging at its threshold in the dark, begins not in the cold, but in the last of the heat. It begins with a man named Edmund Greer and a folded piece of paper he had no intention of giving back. Greer was the largest man in the valley in every sense that mattered. Broad through the shoulders, decisive in his pronouncements, the kind of man who had built half the structures in the settlement with his own hands and had spent the other half of his life deciding what happened to everything else. He had met Ilara that morning in front of the general store, flanked by 2 members of the town council, and he had spoken the way men like him always spoke, as though the matter had already been settled before she arrived. Her husband had left debts. Greer held the largest of them. There was no appeal. There was no negotiation. "The community will not see you starve," he had said, "but it cannot carry you. You are a woman of working age, Mrs. Voss. There is land at the edge of the settlement, a structure. You will have the autumn to make of it what you can." He had paused then, and in the pause there had been something almost like pity, which was worse than contempt. "Your father crossed an ocean chasing dreams and found only a grave. I suspect you understand by now that the apple does not fall far." The women nearby had looked away. The men had found something to study in the middle distance, and Ilara had stood perfectly still, her chin level, her hands folded, and said nothing, because she had learned, long before that morning, that silence is not surrender. Sometimes it is simply the wisest place to keep your powder dry. But she had heard him, every word, and she intended to answer, not with words, but with something that would outlast them both. What Ilara did not know, standing before the general store with the morning sun in her eyes, was that the land he was sending her to was already hers. Not Greer's, not the council's, hers. Her father, Lars Voss, had purchased the orphan's plot years before he died. A quiet transaction, witnessed and signed, conducted in the careful way of a man who trusted neither luck nor the goodwill of strangers. He had meant it as a foundation, a beginning, a place where his daughter might plant something lasting. Edmund Greer had been the witness. He had signed his name to that paper with his own hand, and then he had kept it. The paper sat in his desk, inside a locked box, beneath a false bottom that no one in the valley knew existed. He had told himself, over time, that he was simply holding it, that circumstances had made it complicated, that the land was being put to better use, that Lars Voss was dead, and the dead do not need deeds. He had told himself many things. He kept the paper anyway. The cabin at the edge of the orphan's plot sagged against the tree line like something that had given up arguing with gravity. The chinking between the logs had crumbled to dust. The roof bowed in the center. The stone fireplace at the far wall had collapsed halfway into itself, its chimney choked with the nests of birds long gone. The floor was packed earth, damp and cold, even in the last weeks of summer, smelling of mildew and the quiet rot of forgotten things. Ilara stood in the doorway and breathed it in. Behind her, small fingers found her hand. "Are we going to die here, Ma?" She looked down at Finn, 8 years old, wide-eyed, his dark hair still damp from the creek where they'd stopped to wash their faces before walking into town that morning. The morning that had ended with Edmund Greer's voice, and Edmund Greer's verdict, and the particular cruelty of a man who delivers a sentence while believing he is doing you a kindness. She had not cried then. She would not cry now. She closed her eyes for a moment. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she heard her father's voice, not as a memory, but as a presence, as clear as if he were standing at her shoulder in that ruined doorway. "Fire is the ceremony, little bird. Heat is the gift. The fire is just the door. It is the stone that remembers." She opened her eyes. "No," she said, "because your grandfather taught me something this town has never seen." Finn looked at the cabin. He looked at his mother. And with the particular faith that children carry like a second heartbeat, he nodded. They went inside. That evening, as the first stars appeared above the tree line, Ilara walked the perimeter of the cabin slowly, pressing her heel into the ground at intervals, reading the soil the way her father had taught her, checking for clay deposits, for drainage, for the particular give of earth that would hold shape when packed. Finn followed close behind her, carrying the rusted lantern they had found hanging inside, its light a small warm circle against the darkening air. "What are we looking for?" he asked. "A place to begin," she said. She found it at the northeast corner, a patch of earth with just enough clay in it to hold a seal, just enough slope to drain away from the foundation. She stood over it for a long moment. Then she knelt, pressed her palm flat against the ground, and felt the cold coming up through the soil. "Not for much longer. We start digging tomorrow," she told Finn. He looked at the ground, looked at her. "Are we building a well?" "No." She rose, brushing the earth from her hands. "We are building a stove, one the whole floor will become." Finn was quiet for a moment, turning this over in the careful way he turned most things. Will it work? Ilara looked at the cabin, at the sagging roof and the crumbled chinking and the darkness inside that smelled of endings. Then she looked at her son, his face serious and trusting in the lantern light, his question not a challenge, but a genuine and open thing, the way only a child's questions are. "Your grandfather built boats that held heat against the North Sea," she said. "We have stone, we have clay, we have time." She picked up the lantern. "It will work." They went inside. Scout, the thin stray dog that had appeared at the edge of the property that afternoon, trailing them from a distance with the careful wariness of something that had been disappointed before, settled himself against the outside of the cabin door without being invited. He would still be there in the morning. And somewhere across the valley, in a house that was solid and warm and built by confident hands, Edmund Greer opened a locked box, looked at a folded piece of paper, and closed it again. He did not know why he had taken it out. He told himself it was nothing. He kept it in his pocket for the rest of the night. The first 3 days were the ones she did not speak of later, not because they broke her, but because some things are too close to the bone to wear as a story. Some things you carry quietly, the way you carry the memory of a person you loved, not on your sleeve, not in your mouth, but somewhere deeper, somewhere that does not need an audience. The food they had brought with them was gone by the second morning. A small heel of bread, a handful of dried beans, a strip of salted meat that Finn had made last by eating it in pieces no larger than his thumbnail. When it was gone, and there was nothing to replace it with, and no one to ask. Ilara said she had already eaten. She said it each time Finn looked at her across the small fire she built in the ruined hearth. A cautious fire, carefully tended, because she could not afford to waste what little heat it made before she had built something better. She said it without flinching. She had learned that particular skill from her mother, who had fed 3 children through a winter that had no right to be as hard as it was, and who had never once let them see her hunger. Finn believed her. He was 8. He wanted to believe her. On the second night, the fire burned low, and she let it, because the wood was almost gone, and she had not yet found a way to get more. She sat with her back against the least damaged wall and pulled Finn close and wrapped what blankets they had around both of them and listened to the wind move through the gaps in the chinking like it owned the place. She thought about her father. She thought about the drawings, those careful, patient diagrams spread across the workbench in the boatyard, the chalk lines showing the path of heat through stone, the way he would trace the route with one finger as though following a river on a map. She thought about his hands, which were always warm, even in the coldest weather, in a way she had never quite understood until she was old enough to understand that some people carry their warmth on the inside. She was going to build that warmth into the ground itself. She just needed to survive long enough to do it. The fever came on the 3rd night, quietly, the way fevers arrive in children. A warmth at the forehead that becomes a heat that becomes something else entirely. Finn did not complain. He simply grew still, and then quieter than still. And when Ilara pressed her lips to his temple, she felt it. The dry, papery burn that meant his body was fighting something she could not see. She did not panic. Panic was a luxury she had already left behind, somewhere on the road between the town and this plot of land. She went outside in the dark. The woods behind the cabin were a wall of shadow, and she moved through them by memory and by feel, her hands finding the bark of trees she had noted during the daylight hours, her feet reading the ground through the thin soles of her boots. Her mother had taught her this too. The names of things, the uses of things, the knowledge that the forest does not withhold its medicine from those who know how to ask for it. She found what she needed, came back, boiled it in the small tin pot, the steam rising up into the cold air of the cabin, and sat beside Finn and gave it to him in small sips, and held him when he shivered, and hummed the song her mother had hummed. A slow, shapeless melody that had no name and needed none, until the shivering stopped and his breathing deepened and the heat in his forehead began, slowly, to recede. She watched him sleep until the sky outside began to change. Then she stood up, went to the corner where she had leaned the shovel she had found in the debris of the old cabin wall, and picked it up. There was work to do. The dog appeared that morning as though it had always been there. It was a thin, rough-coated creature of indeterminate color, somewhere between brown and gray and the particular shade of something that has been rained on too many times. Its ribs were visible beneath the coat. Its ears were ragged at the tips. It sat at the edge of the property and watched Ilara begin to dig with the careful, assessing attention of an animal deciding whether this was a place worth the risk. Finn found it when he woke. He stood in the cabin doorway, wrapped in a blanket, and looked at the dog. And the dog looked back at him. and something passed between them that required no translation. "Can we keep him, Ma?" Ilara did not stop digging. "We have nothing to feed him. He doesn't look like he's been fed much anyway." This was true. Ilara glanced at the dog. The dog looked at her with eyes that were steady and brown, and entirely without performance. "He can stay outside," she said, "if he chooses to stay." Finn named him Scout before the morning was out. And Scout, as though he had heard and accepted the terms of the arrangement, moved from the edge of the property to the door of the cabin, where he settled himself into a position that managed to suggest both rest and vigilance simultaneously. He did not beg. He did not bark. He simply stayed. By nightfall, he was inside. Ilara did not comment on this. The system her father had designed was not complicated in principle, only in execution. The core of it was a long, winding channel cut into the earth beneath the cabin floor. A flue, sealed with clay and lined with stone, that would force the hot gases from a small fire to travel slowly through the ground before escaping. The distance of the journey was the point. A fire burning in a conventional stove sends its heat straight up the chimney, spending most of its energy warming the sky. Her father's design refused to allow that waste. The heat was made to linger, to move through stone and clay and compacted earth, and in the lingering, it surrendered its warmth into the mass of the ground itself. The ground then became the stove. And stone, unlike air, does not forget what it has been given. The trench needed to be 3 feet deep and roughly 40 feet in total length. A serpentine path that began at a small external firebox she would build at one end of the cabin and terminated at a low vent at the other, with the entire underside of the floor lying above it. She would line it with the flat stones she had found along the creek bed. She would seal the joints with clay she'd identified in the soil near the northeast corner. She would cover it with large capstones and pack the remaining earth tightly back in place until the floor above showed nothing, gave away nothing, and the heat moved through it invisibly, rising up through the boards as a steady, even warmth that had no source a visitor could point to. Her father had called it a mass heater. He had called it patient fire. She called it the only chance they had. The work was brutal. The ground had spent the summer hardening itself, and it gave up each shovelful grudgingly. The clay and stone mixed together in ways that required the pickaxe she had found beneath the collapsed fireplace debris. Her hands, which had been soft once, not so long ago, in a different life, had moved through blisters and rawness, and now into a new kind of callus that did not hurt anymore, but simply worked. She dug in the mornings while the light was good. She hauled stones from the creek in the afternoons, loading them into the old wooden cart she had repaired with rope and salvaged boards. She mixed clay with the sand she screened from the creek bed, adding water until the mixture reached a consistency her father had described as cooperative, the clay that holds without cracking, that seals without shrinking. She kept the work below the level of the cabin's broken windowsills, not for any strategic reason, simply because she was not ready yet for an audience. During those early weeks, Finn had taken to handing her stones before she asked for them. He would sit at the edge of the trench with his legs folded and his slate across his knees and watch her work with an expression of total attention. And when she reached out, there was always a stone already in motion toward her hand. She did not comment on this. But that evening, when he was asleep, she sat on the completed section of the floor and pressed both palms flat and felt the warmth. Faint, just beginning, like a rumor of something larger. and thought, he is learning this too. Without knowing, he is learning it. He is watching the way he watched his grandfather once, taking it in through the skin. She thought about what it means to teach someone without teaching them, to simply do a thing carefully and repeatedly in their presence, until the doing becomes familiar enough to pass between you like a language neither of you had to study. She had learned that way. She was passing it on the same way. The work continued, day after day, stone after stone, the channel taking shape beneath the earth. But the audience came anyway. Edmund Greer arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, as certain as weather. He came alone, which meant he had not brought witnesses, which meant Ilara understood that this was not official. This was something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or the particular unease of a man whose predictions are failing to come true on schedule. He stood at the edge of the excavation and looked down at the trench she had cut. 4 days of work visible in the ground, the stones already laid in the first 10 feet of the channel, the clay joints smoothed with a careful hand. "That is a ditch," he said. Ilara did not stop working. "It will be a flue." A flue runs up a chimney. That runs sideways through the dirt. Yes. She placed a stone, checked its level, pressed clay into the joint beside it. That is the point. Greer was quiet for a moment in the way of a man who has run his territory long enough that silence from others is his natural expectation. Ilara's failure to fill the silence seemed to trouble him slightly. "A stove sits inside a house," he said, "where it can do its work. My stove will sit under the house." She smoothed the clay with her thumb. "The fire is temporary. The heat can be taught to stay." "Heat rises," Greer said. "That is the first law of nature, and the first law of building. You build a fire, the heat goes up the chimney. Your job is to make as much heat as you can before it escapes. What you are doing here is burying it." Ilara stood, straightened her back, and looked at him directly for the first time. "Hot air rises," she said, "but heat itself moves in every direction, into whatever is nearest and cooler. I am putting a great deal of cool stone very near to it." She looked back at the trench. "I am asking the heat to stay a little longer before it leaves. To pay its rent, my father used to say." Greer stared at her. The metaphor had not reached him. "You will freeze," he said, not cruelly, simply with the flat certainty of a man reading a ledger. "When the cold comes in earnest, you will come to town, and we will find you a room. And this," he gestured at the trench, "the stones, this cart loaded with clay, will be a lesson about the cost of stubbornness." He turned and walked back toward the road. Ilara watched him go. Then she picked up the next stone. Reverend Aldous came 3 days later, which told her that Greer had talked. The Reverend was a thin man with a thin mouth and the particular energy of someone who has mistaken certainty for wisdom for so long that the two have become indistinguishable to him. He stood at a slight distance from the trench, as though proximity to foolishness was itself a moral risk. "Voss's folly," he said by way of greeting. Ilara looked up. "That is what they are calling it," he said. "I thought you should know." "I do know," she said. "I heard it at the creek this morning." She went back to work. Names only matter if you let them in. Reverend Aldous delivered a brief address on the subject of pride and the particular dangers of a woman who overestimates her own understanding of the natural order. Ilara listened with the patient surface of someone who has heard this particular sermon in one form or another since she was old enough to have opinions. She did not argue. Argument would have required her to stop working, and she had 17 more feet of trench to cut before the light failed. The Reverend left feeling, she suspected, that he had done his duty. She cut 14 feet of trench before the light failed. She would get the last 3 in the morning. Finn found the slate on a Thursday. He had been spending his afternoons exploring the creek bed while Ilara worked. She could hear him moving through the shallows, the small splashes, the occasional quiet commentary he directed at Scout, who followed him everywhere now with the earnest devotion of a creature that has decided, having found something worth protecting, not to take the assignment lightly. He came back that afternoon carrying a flat piece of dark gray slate, roughly the size of a dinner plate, smooth on one side. "Look, Ma," he held it up, "for my lessons." Ilara stopped. She looked at the slate, at her son's face, serious and hopeful, the same expression he wore when he had solved something that had been troubling him, the particular satisfaction of a child who has found the right tool for the right purpose. She had not thought about lessons. She had not thought about anything beyond the next 10 feet of trench, the next bucket of clay, the next stone laid and sealed. She had been so focused on survival that she had forgotten, for a moment, that survival was not the destination. It was only the door. She turned away before he could see her face. "That is a very good stone," she said, when she trusted her voice again. Finn sat down on the upturned cart and began to practice his letters on the slate with a piece of lighter rock. Scout arranged beside him with his chin on his paw, watching the letters appear with what seemed to be genuine interest. Ilara went back to work. But something had shifted in the quality of her determination, deepened, perhaps, taken on a weight it had not carried before. She was not building warmth only for herself. She was building it for a boy who thought, in the middle of all of this, to find a stone for his lessons. She had been so fixed on survival that she had nearly forgotten what survival was for. She dug until it was too dark to see. The woman came on a Friday evening, when the sky was doing something extraordinary with the last of the light, turning it amber and rose, and a particular shade of violet that had no name but deserved one. Ilara heard footsteps on the path and looked up, expecting Greer or the Reverend or the young men who had taken to riding past the property on their way to wherever young men go when they want an audience for their disdain. Instead, it was a woman she recognized only vaguely. Older, with white hair pinned back simply and hands that spoke of decades of work, moving with the unhurried certainty of someone who has decided to do something and is not interested in being talked out of it. She set a covered pot down on the flat stone near the cabin door. She did not speak. She looked at the trench, the stones laid, the clay sealed, the capstones beginning to go over the top of the first section, and her expression changed in a way that was difficult to read. Not surprise, exactly. Something more like recognition. She turned and walked back the way she had come. "Who was that?" Finn asked. "I don't know her name," Ilara said, "but she brought us supper. It was the first hot meal in 9 days. They ate it sitting on the cabin floor with Scout between them, the pot passed back and forth, and Finn said it was the best thing he had ever tasted, which was the kind of thing that only hunger can make true, and which Ilara did not argue with. The woman came back 4 days later. This time she came after dark, and she came alone, and she came without the pot. She knocked, a single, quiet knock that Scout heard before Ilara did, and that he answered with a low sound in his throat, not quite a growl, more of an announcement. When Ilara opened the door, the woman stepped inside without waiting to be invited. She looked around the cabin, at the floor now half covered with boards laid over the completed section of the flue, at the clay drying on the walls Ilara had begun to repair, at Finn asleep in the corner with Scout pressed against his back. Then she looked at Ilara. "My name is Marta Halverson," she said in the low, careful voice of someone choosing each word with intention. "My family came from Norway, same as yours. I knew your father by reputation, though we never met." Ilara waited. "Your father's name is on a paper," Marta said. "A deed for this land. Greer has it. I was there when it was signed." Her eyes were clear and steady. "I watched him put his name to it as witness, years ago, before your father died." The silence between them was very full. "Do you have proof?" Ilara asked. "Only what I saw." Marta held her gaze. "I am an old woman, and my word is the word of an old woman in a town where Edmund Greer's word is a different thing entirely. I know what that means." Ilara looked at the floor, the boards over the warm earth, the sealed stone beneath them. "Why are you telling me?" Marta looked at her for a long moment. "Because someone should have told you the day you arrived." She moved toward the door. "I am sorry it took me this long to be brave enough." She left. Ilara stood still for a long time after the door closed. The fire in the small external firebox she had built that week was already out. It only needed to burn an hour each morning now, and the floor held the warmth through the day and well into the night. The boards under her feet were gently, steadily warm. Her father's land, her father's knowledge, her father's name on a paper that someone had hidden. She pressed her palm flat against the floor. "I know," she said, to no one present and everyone gone. 4 days after Marta's visit, Officer Tate arrived. He came in the middle of the morning, which was a choice. Morning was when Ilara was deepest in the work, when stopping costs the most. He was a compact, careful man who did his job with a thoroughness that precluded personal feeling, or at least appeared to. He held a folded document at his side in the particular way of someone who has delivered bad news often enough to have developed a posture for it. The council had voted. The land was needed for a mill project. Ilara had 3 weeks to vacate. He delivered this information and waited for a response. Ilara took the document, read it, folded it back along its original creases with steady hands, looked at him. "Thank you for bringing this yourself," she said. "I know it wasn't a comfortable errand." Tate blinked. That was not the response he had prepared for. He left. And Ilara stood at the edge of the trench, nearly complete now, all 40 feet of it, the stones laid and sealed and capped and covered, and felt the ground she was standing on as though it were speaking to her in a language just below hearing. 3 weeks? That night, after Finn was asleep, she sat alone in the repaired cabin and turned the problem over the way her father turned problems, not fighting them, but walking around them, looking for the shape. She could leave, find somewhere else, keep Finn safe in a more immediate way, a way that did not require her to fight a man like Greer with nothing but a deed she couldn't produce and an old woman's memory. Finn made a sound in his sleep, a small, comfortable sound, the kind that means the dreams are good. She looked at him, at the boards under his sleeping form, gently warm from the earth below, at the mended walls that kept the night outside. at Scout lying across the threshold as though he had been stationed there by some authority higher than any of them. She did not leave. In the morning, she went back to work. Now you might wonder, what kind of woman builds a stove under her floor while a man with a deed threatens to take everything? The answer is exactly this kind. The kind who knows that the only argument worth making is the one you make with your hands. It was Finn who saw the stranger first. He came running from the direction of the road with Scout at his heels and a look on his face that was not quite alarm and not quite excitement, but somewhere in the middle, the expression of a child who has encountered something new and is not yet sure what category it belongs to. "There's a man on the road," he said. "He's got a bag, a big one, like he's going somewhere or coming from somewhere, and he's looking at the cabin." Ilara straightened, looked toward the road. The man was about 40, lean, with the slightly worn look of someone who travels more than they rest. He wore a good coat that had seen better days and carried a leather bag that was old and soft and clearly heavy with use. He was standing at the edge of the property with his hands in his pockets, looking at the cabin with an expression she could not read from this distance. He saw her looking and raised one hand, not quite a wave, more of an acknowledgement. She did not wave back. She waited. He came down the path at an unhurried pace, the kind that suggested he was not accustomed to being unwelcome and was giving her time to adjust her assessment of him. "Silas Drummond," he said, when he was close enough to speak at a normal volume. "I am a land attorney. I have been retained to examine certain property disputes in this valley. I was told there might be a matter of interest here." Ilara looked at him for a moment. "Who told you?" "A woman in town. Older, white hair. She didn't give her name. She simply said, 'If you find yourself on the road past the orphans plot, stop and look at what is being built there.' She said the name on the deed might interest you." "Marta?" Ilara held very still. Behind her, she heard Finn's quiet intake of breath and Scout's tail moving against the grass. "The council has given me 3 weeks to leave," she said. "What can a land attorney do in 3 weeks?" Silas Drummond set down his bag, put his hands back in his pockets, and looked at her with the calm, considering eyes of someone who has been told that problems are impossible before, and has not always found that to be accurate. "That depends entirely on where the original records are filed," he said, "and how cooperative the filing office chooses to be." He paused. "May I look at what you've built?" Ilara stepped back. He walked the length of the completed floor, crouched down at the edge where the boards met the old cabin wall, and pressed his palm flat against the wood, held it there. Finn watched him from the doorway. "It's warm," he offered. "The whole floor. Ma built it that way." Silas looked up at Ilara. Something in his expression had shifted. A recalibration, quiet and complete. "Your father's design?" he asked. She blinked. "You know it?" "I know of it. I grew up near a harbor. There was an old Norwegian shipwright who heated his workshop with something similar." He stood. "I always wondered who had taught him." The afternoon light came through the repaired window at a low angle, warm and unhurried. Scout had settled himself near Silas's bag and was smelling it with the thoughtful concentration of a creature doing serious professional work. Finn, watching the attorney with the measuring look of a child taking someone's temperature, said nothing until Silas had gone and the evening was coming on. "He looks at you funny, Ma. In a good way, I think." Ilara said nothing, but she did not say he was wrong. 2 days before the end of Ilara's 3 weeks, Greer came back. He brought Reverend Aldous and Officer Tate with him this time, which made it official, which meant it was also a performance for anyone watching from the road. He stood at the edge of the property with his hands clasped behind his back and looked at the cabin, at the patched walls, the sound roof, the boards of the completed floor visible through the open door, the small external firebox built neatly into the stone at the cabin's end. He looked for a long time. Ilara stood in the doorway and waited. "The council's position has not changed," Greer said. "I know," said Ilara. "The 3 weeks are nearly—" "Mr. Drummond?" Silas stepped out from the far side of the cabin where he had been examining the claywork on the firebox. He was carrying a leather document folder and wearing the particular expression of a man who has been in rooms with difficult men before and has learned not to bring more energy to the confrontation than the moment requires. "I am investigating the original land documentation for this parcel," he said. "Any action to remove the current occupant while that investigation is underway would constitute an improper interference with a legal proceeding. I would advise against it." Greer looked at Silas. The look was long and level and entirely without warmth. "There is nothing to investigate," he said. "That," said Silas pleasantly, "remains to be seen. I expect to have something definitive within the fortnight." The 3 men left. Ilara waited until they were gone. Then she let out a breath she had been holding for what felt like considerably longer than the conversation had lasted. Finn appeared at her elbow. "Are we going to be okay?" She looked at the floor of the cabin, felt, through the soles of her boots, the faint, steady warmth rising from the earth below. "Yes," she said, "but we're not done yet." Scout pressed his nose into her hand. She scratched his ears. The evening came on cold and clear, and somewhere in the locked box in Edmund Greer's house, a folded piece of paper waited with the patience of a thing that knows it will eventually be found. And in the cabin at the edge of the orphan's plot, the floor was warm, quietly, persistently, impossibly warm. And the woman who had built it stood in the doorway and looked at the sky and thought about stone and what it remembers, and how long a thing can hold the warmth it has been given. Longer than anyone expects. Always longer than anyone expects. What would you have done in her place? Standing on land that was yours and couldn't be proven. Building something no one believed in. Choosing every morning to stay. Marta came at midnight, not with food this time, not with the careful, purposeful energy of a woman delivering something that might help. She came the way people come when they have made a decision they know will cost them, quietly, quickly, with the particular economy of movement of someone who does not want to be seen. Scout heard her first. He lifted his head from the floor and made a low sound. Not alarm, only attention. And Ilara was already awake, because she had not been sleeping deeply in weeks. She opened the door before Marta knocked a second time. The older woman stepped inside. She was wearing her outdoor coat despite the hour, which told Ilara this was not a visit she had planned to extend. She pressed a small bundle into Ilara's hands. Cloth wrapped around something solid. Dried meat, a fold of hard bread, a twist of salt. Provisions. The kind you pack for someone who will need them. "My husband was told this morning," Marta said. Her voice was low and even, the voice of a woman who has already done her grieving over a decision and arrived now at the other side of it. "His contract with the mill comes up at the end of the month. Greer's foreman made it clear how the renewal would go, depending on certain choices made at home." She paused. "I cannot come anymore." Ilara held the bundle. "I understand," she said. "I don't think you do." Marta looked at her steadily. I am not telling you this to explain myself. I am telling you because you need to know what you are up against, and I would rather you know it clearly than discover it slowly." She pulled her coat tighter. Edmund Greer does not make threats. He makes adjustments. Small ones, quiet ones, spread across years. That is why he is still standing, and most people who crossed him are not. She moved toward the door, stopped. "The paper exists," she said, without turning around. "I did not imagine it. I am not a woman who imagines things." A breath. "I will not forget what I saw." And then she was gone. Ilara stood in the middle of the cabin with the bundle in her hands and listened to the sound of Marta's footsteps fading into the dark. Scout came and pressed his head against her leg. She did not move for a long time. In the corner, Finn slept on, his breathing slow and even, his hand curled loosely near his face, the way it had been since he was an infant. She set the bundle down on the shelf she had built from salvaged planks, sat on the edge of the floor, warm beneath her, always warm now, the stone below holding its charge like a quiet promise, and thought about what it means to be alone, not lonely. That was a different thing, and she had been lonely before, in rooms full of people. In the years of her marriage, when she had understood, gradually and then all at once, that the man she had married had confused possession with love, and had never found the error worth correcting. This was the particular aloneness of someone standing at the edge of a fight with nothing in their hands but the truth, and the truth unwitnessed, being worth very little in a room full of men with pens and ledgers. She pressed her palms flat against the warm floor and held them there. She thought about her father. She thought about the paper, his name on it, his careful handwriting that she would have recognized anywhere, the signature that meant he had thought of her future even when the future must have seemed very far away. He had bought this land and signed his name to it and left it for her, and then he had died, and the paper had ended up in the wrong hands, and she had spent these months building the thing he had wanted her to have, without knowing she was building it on what was already hers. There was something in this that she couldn't quite name. Not comfort, not justice, something quieter than either. The sense that her father had, in his patient and practical way, arranged things as well as he could, and that the arrangement had simply taken longer to work itself out than anyone had planned. She thought, he trusted the stone. He built the warmth into everything. He believed that what you put into a thing, care, knowledge, intention, would stay there and wait for whoever needed it. She pressed her palms harder against the warm boards. He had been right. Silas was gone. He had left 2 days earlier, with his leather bag and his careful eyes and the promise that he was following something promising. Records in a filing office farther away. A trail of paperwork that might, if the right documents had survived, constitute evidence of what Marta had seen. He had not said when he would be back. He had said he would send word if he found anything. He had not sent word. The town said he had given up. She heard it at the well the next morning, from a woman who was not speaking to her, but was speaking loudly near her, which amounted to the same news delivered with a different kind of cruelty. The lawyer fellow had gone. Nothing to find. The Voss woman would be out by the end of the fortnight. Ilara drew her water and went home. She did not believe Silas had given up, but belief, like the truth, needed more than itself to stand on. It was Scout who told her first. She had noticed it before in him, a quality of attention that went beyond what the senses should have been able to gather, some instrument in him tuned to a frequency she couldn't hear. He had woken her twice in the past weeks when something was wrong. Once when a branch had weakened and was about to fall against the cabin wall. Once when Finn had slipped into too deep water at the creek and needed a noise made on his behalf before pride made him pretend otherwise. Now Scout stood at the cabin door in the early afternoon, not pacing, not whining, but utterly still in a way that was its own kind of alarm. His nose worked the air in slow, deliberate pulls. His body faced northwest, and it did not move. "What is it?" Finn asked, looking up from his slate. Ilara wiped her hands on her work cloth and stepped outside. The sky was the color of old bone. Not gray exactly, but something yellower. Something that sat wrong against the horizon the way a bruise sits wrong against skin. The air was completely still. Not the stillness of a mild afternoon, but the stillness of a held breath. The kind that comes before something exhales very suddenly and very large. She stood in the yard and felt it against her face. A pressure, subtle and low. The kind that sits behind the eyes and says without words that the atmosphere is arranging itself for something it has been building toward for a while. Her father had described this once. He had been speaking about the sea, about the way a great storm announces itself to those who know how to listen, long before it becomes visible on the horizon. He had said, "The sky changes color the way a person's face changes color, not all at once, but in layers, each one telling you something the last one only implied." He had said, "When the candle bends wrong, go inside. When the animals stop moving, go inside. When the air forgets to breathe, go inside." She looked at Scout. He had not moved. His attention was fixed on the northwest sky with the intensity of something reading a message written too large to see all at once. "Stay close," she told Finn. She went to find the town. The meeting was already in session when she arrived. Not a formal meeting, only the informal gathering that collected most evenings around the general store's porch, where news moved in both directions and decisions were made while pretending to be conversations. Greer was there, Reverend Aldous, Officer Tate, several of the older farmers, a handful of wives, the young men who usually arranged themselves at the edge of such gatherings like punctuation marks. Ilara stepped into the circle of lamplight. The conversations did not stop exactly. They adjusted, thinned, left a particular quality of silence around her that she had grown accustomed to. The sound of a group of people rearranging themselves around the presence of someone they have collectively decided to regard as peripheral. "The weather is turning," she said. "Something large is coming. The animals are already responding to it. The pressure in the air—" "Mrs. Voss." Greer's voice was not unkind. This was worse. "This is not a matter for... I am asking you to listen." She looked around the circle, not pleading, stating, "I grew up on a northern coast. My father taught me what the sky looks like before a storm that means it. This sky is that sky. The pressure..." "The woman who buries wood under her floor," said one of the young men from the edge, not loudly, but clearly, and with the particular timing of someone who has prepared the line in advance and has been waiting for the right moment, "is now reading the weather." The laughter was not universal, but it was enough. Reverend Aldous stepped forward with the gentle, certain manner of a man who believes he is offering comfort. "God sends the storms, Mrs. Voss, and God ends them. It is not given to us to predict his hand. What is given to us is the wisdom to trust in his provision. With respect, Reverend, God also gave us eyes to read the sky and the sense to come in out of the rain. She looked at him steadily. I am asking you to use them. She looked around the circle one more time. At the edge of the group, a young woman, Nora Webb, Elara had heard her name but barely knew her face, had straightened slightly. Her husband stood close beside her. As Elara's eyes moved past her, Nora Webb opened her mouth, drew a small breath, and then her husband's hand found her arm, and the breath released without words, and Nora looked down at the ground. Elara looked at her for a moment. Then she turned and walked back the way she had come. Behind her, the conversations resumed. Ahead of her, the sky held its particular, terrible stillness. She prepared through the rest of the evening and into the night. She brought everything she could carry inside. The remaining wood stacked beneath the floor, the provisions Marta had left, the water from the creek in every vessel she had. She checked the clay seals on the firebox, the capstones over the flue channel, the repaired chinking on the walls. She checked the roof bracing, the door hinges, the shutter over the single window. She moved through the cabin with the systematic focus of someone going through a list they have been keeping in their head for weeks without knowing it. There was something almost peaceful about this kind of preparation. Not peace in the sense of ease, but peace in the sense of clarity. The particular calm that comes when all the decisions have been made, and what remains is only the execution. She had spent months worrying about the wrong things, she realized. She had worried about the land, about the deed, about Greer and his authority and the council and the 3-week deadline. These were real concerns. They were not the only concerns. She had spent these months also, without fully naming it, preparing for exactly this. Every stone laid in the flue, every joint sealed with clay, every board fitted over the channel. It had all been preparation for a night exactly like this one. She had not known the specific shape the crisis would take, but she had known, with the bone-deep certainty of her father's daughter, that a crisis was coming, and that the only useful thing to do with that knowledge was to build. Finn helped without being asked, which was one of the things about him she stored away in the place where she kept the things she was most grateful for. His instinct to be useful, his ability to read a situation without needing it explained, his quiet acceptance of what was. "Are you scared?" he asked at one point, while they were stacking the last of the wood. She considered the question seriously, because he had asked it seriously. "Yes," she said, "but being scared and being ready are not opposites. You can be both at the same time." Finn thought about this. "Scout's not scared," he offered. "He just keeps watching." "Scout knows he's done everything he can do," Elara said. "That's what makes the watching easier." She banked the fire in the firebox for the last time that evening, a careful fire, controlled, feeding the stone its charge for the hours ahead, and sealed the box and came inside and pulled the door. Scout lay down across the threshold. Finn slept. Elara sat in the center of the warm floor and listened to the night. It came in the hours before dawn, not with warning, not with the gradual build that allows for preparation and adjustment. It came the way certain things come, the things that have been patient and are now finished with patience. The first sound was not wind, but pressure. a low, resonant weight in the air that she felt in her chest before she heard it with her ears. Then the wind arrived. It did not howl. That was the word people used, but it was not accurate. What it did was roar. A vast, continuous, living sound that had volume and texture and a kind of intention, as though the air itself had decided to remove everything that was not anchored down to its satisfaction. The temperature dropped in the space of an hour, and the body registered it not as cold, but as wrongness. The particular wrongness of something that should not be happening and is happening anyway. The snow that came with it did not fall. It moved laterally, driven so hard it was indistinguishable from anything else moving that fast. A wall of white that reduced the visible world to the distance of an outstretched hand. Finn woke to the sound and lay still for a moment, listening. Then he said quietly, "It came. It came," Ilara said. He got up and came and sat beside her, and Scout moved from the door to press himself against Finn's other side, and the three of them sat in the center of the warm floor and listened to the storm take the world apart outside. The cabin held, not because it was grand, not because it had been built for this, but because Ilara had spent every available day and night repairing it. The chinking sealed, the roof braced, the walls reinforced. And because the earth beneath it was doing exactly what her father had designed it to do, releasing its stored warmth steadily and silently into the space above, so that the air inside the cabin was maintained at a temperature that kept them safe, even and steady. This kind of warmth that does not announce itself, only sustains. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, Ilara put her arm around Finn's shoulders and leaned her head against his, and hummed the song her mother had hummed, the slow, shapeless melody without a name. And the three of them waited. The first knock came sometime in the night. It was nearly lost in the sound of the storm, which was not a background now, but a presence, a constant, enormous thing pressing on every surface of the cabin with the disinterest of physics. Scout raised his head, made the announcement sound. Ilara stood, wrapped her coat around her shoulders, and opened the door against the resistance of the wind. Nora Webb stood on the other side. She was holding her child against her chest. A small girl, perhaps 3 years old, wrapped in everything Nora had been able to put on her in the time available, which had not been enough. The child's lips had gone the wrong color. The roof of the back room had come down under the weight of the ice, and there had been nowhere left to go. Nora Webb looked at Ilara across the threshold. She did not speak. Her face said everything she could not. Ilara stepped back. Nora carried her daughter through the door, and Ilara closed the world out behind her. And Finn was already on his feet, pulling the extra blanket from his sleeping place. And Scout was already moving toward the child with the careful, deliberate approach of an animal who understands his role in these situations. They got the child's outer layers off and wrapped her in the dry blanket and set her directly on the floor. The warm floor, which did what it always did, rising into the cold of her small body with a patient persistence that required nothing from her in return, and Scout settled himself beside her and did not move. Within a quarter of an hour, the child's color had changed. Nora Webb sat with her back against the cabin wall and shook, very slightly, for a long time. Ilara brought her warm water and sat beside her without speaking and let her shake. They came one after another through the night, each one a story told in wet coats and cold hands, and the particular exhausted expression of someone who has understood something too late to have prevented understanding it. Reverend Aldous, his hat gone, his coat dark with ice, the windows of the church having given way. He stood at the door and looked at Alara, and she saw in his face something she had not seen there before. Not shame, exactly, which requires a level of self-reflection that tends to come later, but a rawness, as though the usual composure had been taken off along with the hat, and what was beneath it was simply an old man, cold and frightened. She stepped back. He came in. Officer Tate arrived with 3 members of the farming families from the road. They stood inside the door and looked at what was inside the cabin. The warm floor, the calm air, the child asleep against the dog. And no one said anything for a moment. Finn gave them the corner near the firebox, where the boards were warmest. He did this without being told. The young men who had made the bet came deflated. The particular deflation of people whose confidence in their own position has been removed by circumstances more efficiently than any argument could have managed. They did not meet her eyes. They were cold, and they needed warmth. And the warmth was here. And that was all there was to say about it. She stepped back for each of them. She did not say anything each time. She simply made room. Greer came last. She knew he would. She had understood, from the moment she began letting people through the door, that he would be the final one. That the man who had sent her here, and the woman who had built something here, would have to stand in a doorway together before this was finished. He came alone. His son had arrived hours earlier with his family and had simply come and helped and not made anything of it. Greer had not been with them. Now he was at the door. He stood outside in the storm and did not knock. He simply stood, and Scout announced him, and Alara opened the door, and there he was. He looked old. He looked the way very certain people look when their certainty has failed them. Not angry, not defiant, but simply lost, like a man who has been navigating by a star that has turned out to be something else entirely, and does not yet know which direction is which without it. His shoulders were carrying the storm and something heavier than the storm. His hands hung at his sides. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat. He took out a folded piece of paper, not with ceremony, not with any of the gestures of a man making a statement. He simply took it out and held it toward her in a hand that was shaking slightly from the cold. She looked at it, looked at him. The paper was folded along old crease lines, the crease lines of a document that has been folded for a long time, opened occasionally, and folded back along the same lines. It had the texture of something handled. She took it, opened it. Her father's name, the property description, the date, Greer's signature in the witness line, in an ink that had browned with age but remained perfectly legible. The deed to the land beneath her feet. She read it once, read it again, folded it along its original lines. The storm was still roaring outside. Inside, 19 people were breathing in the same warm air, and a child was sleeping against a dog, and the floor was doing quietly and persistently what it had been built to do. Alara looked at Edmund Greer standing outside her door. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not explain. He stood in the storm with the paper given away and looked at her with the face of a man who is not sure what comes next and is, for perhaps the first time in a long time, willing to not know. She stepped to the side. "Come in," she said. "Get warm." He crossed the threshold. She closed the door against the storm, and the storm went on outside, enormous and indifferent. And inside the cabin, the floor was warm. The air was still. And one by one, the people who had closed their doors against her were breathing the warmth she had built out of stone and knowledge and the refusal to leave. The fire had burned out hours ago. The stone remembered. 19 people. Ilara counted them in the gray half-light of the cabin's first full day of holding. Counted them not to know the number, but to know the names, or the faces where she didn't have names, to understand what she had taken responsibility for when she stepped back from that door again and again, and meant it each time. Nora Webb and her daughter, whose name was May, and who was sleeping now with her cheek against Scout's flank, her color restored, her breathing the slow and certain breathing of a child who has been frightened and is now safe, and has decided, with the absoluteness of children, to simply be safe. Reverend Aldous, who had taken the corner farthest from the door and sat with his hands folded on his knees and his eyes open and his mouth, for perhaps the first time in his life, entirely still. Officer Tate, who had organized himself near the wall with the practical efficiency of a man who defaults to usefulness when emotion becomes complicated, and who had, without being asked, taken inventory of their water and their food, and reported to Ilara in a low voice that they had perhaps 2 days of reasonable provision if things were managed carefully. She thanked him. She meant it. The farming families had arranged themselves along the south wall, the adults sitting and the children distributed among the laps, and they had the particular quietness of people who are accustomed to hard seasons and know that silence conserves warmth in ways that conversation does not. Greer's son sat near his father. They did not speak to each other. This was its own kind of information. Greer himself had taken a place near the center of the room, neither claiming the best spot nor retreating to the worst. He sat on the floor with his back against nothing, which was unusual for a man who had spent decades arranging for something solid to be behind him at all times. He was looking at the floorboards. Ilara caught him pressing his palm to them once, when he thought no one was watching. The same gesture she made every morning, the checking of a thing that should not be possible, and keeps being possible anyway. She did not say anything about it. The first task was warmth sustained. The floor was doing its work. It always did its work, steady and silent, the stone beneath giving back what the morning's fire had given it. But 19 bodies in a small space created their own economy of heat, and the problem shifted from generating warmth to distributing it without waste. Ilara moved through the room with the quiet authority of someone who knows the space well enough to see its logic, even when it's full of people she has never shared it with. She put the smallest children on the floor, directly on the boards, where the warmth was most immediate. She put the elderly and the wet along the south wall, away from the door. She moved the dry blankets to the people who were still shivering and redirected the damp ones toward the area nearest the firebox, where the residual heat would dry them through the day. Nora Webb watched her work. At a certain point, May, 3 years old, recovered now and awake and apparently unimpressed by the extraordinary circumstances of her situation, began to cry in the low, persistent way of a child who is no longer frightened, but is now simply tired of not having what she wanted. Nora looked stricken. The sound was not loud, but in a small space full of exhausted people, it had the potential to become a problem of a different kind. "She needs something to do," Finn said. He was sitting near Scout, who was near May, which had been the arrangement since the beginning. He said this with the easy authority of someone who had been 3 years old relatively recently and remembered what it required. He moved to sit beside May, took the flat piece of slate from where it lived on the shelf and held it out to her, took a bit of lighter stone and showed her how to make a mark on it. May stopped crying. She made a mark. She made several marks. She made something that may have been a dog and showed it to Scout, who received it with the grave attention he gave most things. The crying stopped. Nora let out a breath that seemed to have been waiting a long time to be released. "Thank you," she said to Alara rather than to Finn. Her voice was low and had something in it that was working itself towards something larger. "She told us," she said. Her husband across the room looked at his hands. "At the meeting, she told all of us." A pause. I was going to stand up. "I know," Alara said. "I should have." Alara looked at May, who was now showing Scout her slate drawing with the seriousness of an artist presenting work to an important critic. "You're here now," she said. "That's what matters." The second night was quieter than the first. The storm had not stopped. It pressed on against the walls with a relentlessness that stopped feeling dramatic and started feeling simply like a fact of existence. But the people inside had adjusted to it, the way people adjust to any enormous thing that is not immediately killing them. The children slept. The adults took turns at a kind of half-waking rest, one eye on the door, one ear on the storm, the body doing what it could with the space available. Alara moved through the room every few hours, checking. On one such pass, in the deep quiet of the second night, she found Edmund Greer awake. He was sitting exactly where he had been since he came in the center of the room, back against nothing. But his eyes were open, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not the calculating assessment she was accustomed to. Not the flat certainty. Something rawer. Something that looked, in the dim light, uncomfortably like a man meeting himself after a long absence, and not finding the reunion easy. She sat down a little apart from him, close enough to speak quietly, far enough that it was its own kind of honesty. Neither of them spoke for a while. This was not uncomfortable. The storm provided enough sound to fill any silence, and people around them were sleeping, and silence between two people who have said everything that needed saying through their actions can have its own kind of completeness. Then Greer said, quietly enough that no one else would hear, "I kept it for 2 years." She did not ask what he meant. "The first year, I told myself it was complicated, that your father's arrangements had not been properly registered, that I was waiting to understand the situation more clearly." He paused. "The second year, I stopped telling myself anything about it. I just kept it." The floor was warm under them both. "I told myself, when you arrived," he continued, "that it was simpler to let things stand as they were, that the land would be put to better use, that you would manage." A short exhale, not quite a laugh. "I was very good at telling myself things." Alara looked at the floor between them. "My father was a builder," she said. "Not of grand things, small things. Things that worked because he understood the principles behind them, not because he forced them. He used to say that the worst structures are the ones built around a flaw and never corrected, because eventually everything built on top of that flaw carries the flaw." Greer was quiet for a moment. "Buildings," he said. "Buildings," she agreed, "among other things." He looked at his hands, which had built most of the structures in this valley. Good structures, sturdy ones, built with skill and intention, and the very real knowledge of a man who had spent his life learning how things hold together. He had always taken pride in those hands, in what they could make, in the way a building, when it was done right, stood exactly as he had imagined it would stand, plumb and solid and indifferent to the weather. He had thought, for most of his life, that this was enough, that a man who builds well has done what a man is supposed to do. He was beginning to understand that building well and building right were not always the same thing. "I came tonight," he said, "because I could not carry it any longer." He did not look at her. Not the paper, the weight of it. The storm pressed at the walls. "I know," she said. They sat without speaking after that, in the warm room full of sleeping people and one calm dog, until Greer's eyes closed and his breathing deepened and he slept, perhaps for the first time in a long while, without whatever it was that had been keeping him from it. Ilara did not sleep, but she sat with the warmth rising through the floor into her hands and thought about stone and what it holds and how long, and felt, not triumph, not vindication, not the satisfaction she had once imagined this moment might carry, but something quieter, something that felt, in the particular way of unexpected things, almost like rest. It was Scout who reached the boy. The child's name was Thomas. He belonged to one of the farming families, 8 years old, a year younger than Finn, and he had not spoken since the moment his family's barn roof had come down during the first hours of the storm. He had not been injured. His body was intact and warming steadily, but he sat against the south wall with his arms around his knees and his eyes at a fixed middle distance that those around him recognized as the place a person goes when the present is too loud. He had been there for most of 2 days. Finn had tried. He had offered the slate, offered the game he had invented with the lighter stones, offered the simple companionship of sitting nearby. Thomas had not responded to any of it, not unkindly, only distantly, as though the signal was not getting through. Scout solved it without strategy. He simply walked over to the boy, slowly, with the unhurried directness of an animal who has decided to do something and sees no reason to be dramatic about it, and lay down against his side, not leaning, not demanding, simply present, warm, substantial, a solid thing at a time when everything solid had proved unreliable. Thomas did not move. Scout did not move. 5 minutes passed. 10. The room went on around them. The low conversations, Finn's lesson with May, the sound of Ilara organizing the second distribution of food, the storm continuing its business outside. Then Thomas's arms, which had been locked around his own knees, loosened slightly. One hand moved by increments until it rested on Scout's back. Scout exhaled. A long, slow breath. The kind that means everything is exactly as it should be. The hand began very gently to move. "Can I keep petting him?" Thomas asked. His voice was rough from disuse and small from somewhere else, but it was there, present, back. His mother, who had been watching from 2 feet away with the held-in quality of someone who has been not breathing for a very long time, made a sound. It was not a word. It didn't need to be. Finn looked at Ilara across the room with the expression of a child who knows he has just witnessed something important. She nodded at him, very slightly. He looked back at Scout with the particular pride of someone whose friend has done something worthy. The knock at the door came in the deepest part of the second night, when even the storm seemed to have settled into a lower register, as though it too had tired of its own volume. Scout lifted his head, made his announcement, not alarm, recognition. Ilara crossed to the door and opened it. Snow came in with the wind, and behind the snow, Silas Drummond. He was covered in ice in the way of someone who has been traveling through conditions that do not care about human plans. His coat was stiff with it. His bag was strapped across his body, and wrapped in oilskin specifically to protect what was inside. He had turned back the moment the sky changed color, pushing harder than was wise, because he had learned enough about her to know that the warm door would be the only warm door, and he had not intended to be on the wrong side of it. He stood in the doorway and looked at her, and she looked at him, and the storm made its sound behind him, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because the moment was already full. "I found them," he said. "The original filings. 3 copies, 2 of them still legible." He held up the oilskin-wrapped bag. "It's all here." "I already have the deed," she said. "Greer brought it." Something moved across his face, the particular expression of a man who had gone a very long way to solve a problem and arrived to find it solved, and who was deciding how to feel about that. He settled on a quiet relief that the outcome was the same, regardless of who had solved it. "Good," he said. "Then what I have is confirmation." He stepped inside. The warmth of the cabin closed around him, and he stood for a moment adjusting to the temperature in the way people do when they have been very cold, and then suddenly are not. He looked around the room, took in the sleeping families, the organized order of it, the children arranged on the warm floor, Scout in his place, Finn asleep in the corner with May's discarded slate beside him. His eyes came back to her. She understood, without it being said, that he had come back quickly. That quickly, under the circumstances, had cost something. The room was sleeping. The storm pressed at the walls. She sat back down on the floor near where she had been, and he set down his bag and sat nearby, close enough to speak at a murmur. And for a while, they simply sat in the warm room and listened to the storm losing its argument with the walls. "How long were you traveling?" she asked eventually. "Since I found them." A pause. "I was not going to wait to send a message." Finn, from his corner, made a small sound of sleep. Scout's ear twitched. Silas looked at the floor, at the boards, warm beneath them both. "Your father's design," he said. "You built it from memory." "He was very thorough," she said. "He wanted to make sure whoever came after him could repeat it." "He expected you to need it?" She thought about this. "He expected the world to be difficult," she said. "He wanted to make sure difficult was not the same as impossible." Silas was quiet for a moment. The storm outside had dropped another register, not ending, but shifting, the way a very long night shifts somewhere in its middle, beginning the slow, barely perceptible business of becoming morning. "Finn told me," Silas said, "before I left, he said, 'She'll be fine. She always figures it out.' He said it very matter-of-factly, like a thing that was simply true." Ilara looked at Finn's sleeping form. "He is more confident in me than I am," she said. "Perhaps," Silas said, "he has more information to go on." She looked at him. He was looking at the floor. The line of his face in the dim light was calm and unperforming. The face of a man who has said what he meant to say and is comfortable with having said it. She did not look away. After a while, she was not sure which of them moved first, or if the distance simply changed on its own, the way distances sometimes do in the dark, between two people who have been careful with each other for a long time. But at some point, his hand was near hers on the warm boards of the floor, not holding, only near. She did not move hers away. They sat like that until morning, or what passed for morning. The grayish lightening of the sky through the ice-crusted window that said the night was over, even if the storm was not. The last thing she heard, At the edge of sleep, she finally allowed herself, was Finn's voice, soft, directed at Scout, with the private certainty of a child speaking a truth to someone he trusts completely. I knew he'd come back. The fever broke before the storm did. It had been building in Finn for a day. She had seen it and said nothing. The particular decision of a mother who does not want to be wrong about something this important, who watches and does not name it until she has to. The dry warmth at his forehead, the slight dimming of his attention, the way his eyes tracked things a half-second slower than usual. She had kept him on the warmest boards, had given him the most of the water, had sat beside him in the rotations she allowed herself for sleep, her hand on his back, feeling his breathing, waiting. In the gray early morning of what would turn out to be the last day of the storm, she felt the change under her palm. The fever heat, which is a different kind of heat than warmth, pressurized, effortful, the heat of a body at war with itself, softened, became something cooler, something that breathed. Finn's eyes opened. He looked up at her, looked around the room, at the sleeping families, at Scout nearby, at Silas sitting against the wall with his eyes closed and his bag across his knees. "Are we still here, Ma?" he asked. His voice was clear. Himself. "Yes, sweetheart," she said. "We are still here." Scout, hearing Finn's voice, lifted his head and looked at the boy with the expression of an animal confirming that something precious is still accounted for. Finn reached out and touched the top of Scout's head. Scout closed his eyes and leaned into the touch. Outside, the storm was quieter than it had been. Not gone, but quieter. The gray light through the window was the particular gray of a sky that is considering, for the first time in a long time, the possibility of doing something else. Ilara kept her hand on Finn's back and felt his breathing, slow and even and real, and looked at the warm floor beneath them both. The fire has been out for hours, she thought, and the stone held everything. It always does. The storm ended the way long things end, not with a conclusion, but with an absence. The sound simply stopped being there, and the stopping was so complete that several people woke from sleep at the silence, the way you wake when a clock you have grown used to finally runs down. One moment, the world outside was roaring. The next, it was not. And the quiet was so absolute that it felt, for a breath or two, like the world itself had stopped. Then a child coughed. Scout shifted against the floor. Someone near the south wall exhaled, and the morning began. Ilara opened the cabin door onto a landscape that had been reorganized entirely. The familiar shapes of the property altered beyond recognition by what had passed over them. The fence posts were buried. The path to the creek was visible only as a slight depression in the white. The trees along the tree line stood stripped and bare, their branches bent at angles that spoke of argument and partial defeat. The sky above all of it was pale and washed and very still. The sky of something that has spent itself completely and is now simply resting. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. Behind her, the cabin was warm. In front of her, everything was cold and broken and waiting to see what came next. She stepped out and moved through the settlement, reading the damage as she went. Several roofs had failed. The general store had lost its porch entirely. The church's east window was gone, the frame intact, the glass not. A family on the North Road had lost their chimney, and the Prescott house, the one belonging to Mrs. Prescott, whose husband had been away when the storm came, and whose 3 children had sheltered in the cabin through the worst of it, had lost the entire rear section of its roof. Ilara stood before the Prescott house in the clean, cold morning light and understood this immediately as the kind of loss that could not be walked back. The walls were standing, but the inside was open to the sky, buried in ice, and everything that had been inside was destroyed. Mrs. Prescott stood near what had been her back wall. Her 3 children were clustered close to her. She was looking at the open sky above what had been her kitchen with the stillness of someone who has not yet decided which part of herself to hand the situation to. Ilara went to her, stood beside her, did not speak immediately, because there was nothing that could be said in the first moment of a loss like this that would be worth the air it cost. Some things require witness before they require words. After a while, Mrs. Prescott said, "We had everything sorted, food, wood, all of it sorted for winter." "Yes," Ilara said, "it's all gone." "Yes, the children's things. Everything their father gave them before he—" She stopped. Her hands moved briefly, then stilled again. Ilara waited. "I should have come when you warned us," Mrs. Prescott said at last, not with bitterness, only with the flat, factual tone of a practical woman who has identified an error and names it clearly, because naming it clearly is the only useful thing to do with it now. "Your family is whole," Ilara said. "The rest can be rebuilt." It was not comfort in the soft sense. It was something more durable, the acknowledgement that the bottom had been found, and it was terrible, but it was findable, and that findable bottoms can be pushed off from. Mrs. Prescott nodded once, the firm closing nod of someone turning from one chapter to the next, and told her children in a steady voice that they would be staying with the Voss cabin for a while, and that they were to be helpful and quiet, and that everything was going to be managed. Ilara walked back across the snow toward her own property. She did not feel triumphant. She had expected to in the long, honest nights of the preceding months. Instead, she felt the way you feel after a harvest. The work done, yes, but the field still there, still present, the next season already implicit in the ground. There was more work to do. There was always more work to do. And that, she was beginning to understand, was not a burden. It was the shape of a life that is actually being lived. The reckoning happened in the afternoon, not by arrangement, or not entirely. These things rarely are. They happen because enough people are in the same place at the same time, and the situation has its own gravity, pulling what needs to be said toward the surface, whether anyone has planned for it or not. The general store's interior was intact, even if its porch was not. Someone had cleared the debris from the counter. Silas had laid the documents there in the careful, methodical way of a man presenting evidence. The original deed in Lars Voss's name, the copies from the distant filing office, the dates consistent, the chain of ownership unambiguous, Greer's signature visible on each in ink that had browned with age but remained perfectly legible. Greer stood on the other side of the counter. He had asked for this. He had come to Silas that morning and said, without any preamble, that he wanted the accounting to happen in front of everyone, that doing it quietly would be one more evasion in a long line of them, and he had decided he was done with evasions. Silas read the relevant passages aloud. His voice was even, carrying no satisfaction, no edge of vindication. He read the way a man reads a document when the document is the point and the man is only its vehicle. Greer did not interrupt. When Silas finished, Greer was quiet for a moment, looking at the papers. Then he looked up. He looked at Alara. "The land is yours," he said. "It was always yours. I knew this. I made a choice, and then I made the choice again every day for 2 years, and I told myself things that were not true because the truth was inconvenient." He paused. "I am not asking you to forgive me. I am telling you, in front of everyone who is owed the telling, that I was wrong, and I knew I was wrong, and I did it anyway. That is the truth. It is the only thing I have to offer that is worth anything." The store was quiet. Near the door, Nora Webb stood with May on her hip. She said, to the room rather than to any one person, "She warned us. She came to the meeting and she told us what was coming. She was calm about it. She simply told us, and we chose not to listen. And then we went to her door in the dark, and she opened it." A breath. I want that said out loud, so that everyone who was there remembers that it was said and cannot pretend afterward that they don't know it. No one argued with this. Reverend Aldous turned to Alara and bowed his head. A small bow, deliberate, unadorned. He was a man who had spent his life with words, and he seemed to have understood that this was not a moment for them. Sometimes silence, offered honestly, is the most truthful thing. Officer Tate handed her the official transfer of deed. He had prepared it that morning, which told her he had known how the gathering would go. She took the papers without comment and folded them along the same worn crease lines that her father's original deed had worn, because the creases were already there, and it seemed right to follow them. She put them in her pocket. The weight of them was nothing. The weight of what they represented was everything her father had hoped for when he made his quiet purchase and signed his name and thought, "My daughter will need a place to stand." She saw the young man leaving. He was at the far edge of the settlement, loading his horse with the efficiency of someone who has been thinking about this moment for a while and prepared for it in advance. His bag was already strapped. He was not looking around. She watched him from a distance. She did not call after him. What she felt, watching him go, was not satisfaction and not anger. It was something more complicated, a sorrow that was not about herself at all, but about the particular waste of a life organized around diminishing others as a means of feeling large. The years of small cruelties that had purchased nothing, the laughter that had felt like power and turned out to be debt. He rode out without looking back. She turned away before he was gone. There was a family without a roof on the North Road, and she had already been thinking, since before the gathering ended, about the sequence of steps that would be required to address it. She went to work. The lessons began without announcement. Ilara simply started on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the storm, working the clay mixture at the edge of the Eldridge property with Marta Halverson kneeling beside her. Marta had come back the morning after the storm ended and said nothing about the night she had pressed provisions into Ilara's hands and disappeared. She simply arrived and tied her coat and crouched down and asked what needed to be done. That was Marta. That had always been Marta. People came to the lessons because they needed to know, and the teaching took the shape that teaching takes when it is genuinely needed. Unhurried, practical, without performance. Ilara did not stand up and deliver knowledge from a height. She knelt beside people and showed them with her hands and let them try it themselves, and corrected them without embarrassment when they got it wrong. The knowledge transferred the way her father's knowledge had always transferred, through proximity and repetition, through the accumulated understanding that comes from doing a thing in the presence of someone who has done it well. Finn sat at the front of everyone. He had his slate. He drew the diagrams before Elara finished explaining them, because he had seen them built and carried the logic in his hands as much as in his mind. When an older farmer asked him to explain something, Finn did so without hesitation, pointing at the slate drawing with the calm authority of someone who knows what they know and sees no reason to apologize for it. Greer sat at the back of the 7th lesson and did not speak. He came back for the 8th and 9th as well. On the morning of the 3rd week, he crouched down in the snow beside Elara and looked at the clay mixture she was preparing. "Too much water," he said. She looked at him. "The chinking on your south section kept contracting," he said. 3 parts clay to 1 part sand. Water only until it holds shape without cracking when compressed." She looked at the mixture in her hands. He was right. She adjusted it, pressed it again. It held. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. Then, "Show me the firebox dimensions again. I want to understand the principle well enough to adapt it. Not approximately. Correctly." She looked at him, at the hands that had built most of the structures in this valley, that knew the weight and grain of wood in the particular way of a lifetime's practice, at the face that had been so certain for so long, and was now, she thought, more interesting for being less certain. She crouched down and drew in the snow. He crouched beside her. She explained. He asked 2 questions, both precise, the questions of a craftsman who has identified the exact boundary of his own understanding and wants to know what is beyond it. She answered. He nodded. Not the nod of agreement, but the nod of reception. Something taken in. He stood. She stood. "You built good things," she said. "Solid things. This valley has needed them." He looked across the settlement, at the roof lines, most of them his work, at the buildings that had held through the storm because they had been built with skill. She watched him look at them the way she had seen her father look at his boats before they went into the water. Not pride, exactly, but the particular attention of someone taking inventory of what they know and what they still don't. "They could have been warmer," he said. "They can be," she said. "That's the point." He left without ceremony. She watched him go and felt, very quietly, something she had not expected to feel about Edmund Greer. A kind of respect that had nothing to do with forgetting what he had done, and everything to do with what he had chosen to do with what remained. Redemption was too large a word for it. It was smaller than that. It was a man who had built his life around a lie, and who had put the lie down, and who was now trying to figure out, day by day, what to build in its place. She thought her father would have understood this. He had always said that the worst structures are the ones built around a flaw and never corrected. But he had also said that it is never too late to correct the flaw, as long as you are willing to do the work of undoing what was built on top of it first. No one had asked him to. No one had suggested it. But in the quiet mornings before anyone was awake, Greer had begun to assess the Prescott house in the way of a builder working out a problem before committing to solving it. Elara saw him there one morning, alone, measuring with his hands, his lips moving slightly as he calculated. She did not mention it. She went back to her clay. It was a quiet evening when Silas asked, neither warm nor cold, the particular temperature of the weeks between hard winter and true spring when the air is making up its mind. The light was the tentative, exploratory kind that arrives when the season is just beginning to believe in itself again. Silas had spent the afternoon repairing the south wall's chinking for the third time, working with the patient, methodical care of a man who has decided that being useful in specific practical ways is the most honest form of affection he knows how to offer. Finn was inside. The cabin was warm in the way it was always warm. Silas finished the last section, brushed the clay from his hands, and came to stand beside her where she was looking at the yard, at the firebox, at the vent chimney at the cabin's far end, at the gnarled tree with its deep roots and its patience. "I have been thinking," he said, in the way of a man who has been thinking for some time and has decided the thinking has run its course, about whether I am in the right place. She looked at him. "I believe I am in the right place," he said, "but I wanted to say it plainly in case there was an argument against it that I should hear before making it final." From inside the cabin, audible through the wall. "Say yes, Ma." He fixed the chinking again, without being asked. "That means something." A moment of silence. "Finn," Silas said to the wall, in the measured tone of a man addressing a situation he has decided to take in stride. "That was a private conversation." "The south wall is thin," Finn said from inside. "Has been since the beginning. You should use less water in the clay." Ilara looked at the yard, at the firebox, neat and sealed, at the stub chimney, at the tree under which Scout currently lay in the last of the afternoon light. Old now, slower, with the particular contentment of an animal that has done its job for a long time, and knows it, and is at peace with knowing it. At the settlement in the middle distance, where smoke was rising from 17 chimneys, several of them built on principles that had not existed in this valley a season ago. She looked at Silas. "I don't have an argument," she said. He nodded slowly, as though confirming something he had already known but wanted confirmed. "Good," he said. "That's good." The years that followed were full ones. Rooms were added to the cabin, not all at once, but as the seasons permitted and the need arose. A second sleeping room when the family grew. A covered porch where Silas liked to sit in the evenings with the particular contentment of a man who has found the right chair in the right house. A proper window on the south wall that let the afternoon light in at an angle that Finn, at 12, observed was exactly right, though he could not yet have explained why it pleased him so much to have that bar of gold moving slowly across the warm floor each afternoon at the same hour. The floor remained warm. Silas had stayed, as he had said he would, and he had proven himself in the particular way that quiet men prove themselves, not through declaration but through consistency, through the 1,000 small acts of maintenance and attention that keep a life and a home in order. He was a good stepfather to Finn in the way that Finn needed, present without intrusion, willing to teach when asked and to step back when not. They developed over the years the kind of easy companionship that does not require a great deal of conversation because most of the important things have already been communicated through shared work and shared meals and the simple daily fact of choosing to be in the same place. Finn grew into himself, into the particular kind of man that a boy becomes when the hardest years of his childhood were also the ones that showed him what people are capable of, both the worst of it and the best. He was steady and quiet, and had his mother's way of pressing his palm to any new surface he encountered, reading its warmth the way other people read a room. Scout died on an autumn morning, in the way that old and faithful things die. Not all at once, but in layers, each day a little less of him, until one morning there was peacefully none. He had slowed through the summer. A little less ground covered each day, a little more time spent in the places he loved, as though he were making a careful inventory of them. There was a period, in the weeks before the end, when Alara would watch him in the evenings. The way he moved from his place by the door to the warm center of the floor, the deliberate choice of it, the settling that was slower than it used to be, but no less purposeful. She thought about what it means to know your own body well enough to seek exactly what it needs. He had always known what he needed, and he had always, without drama, gone and gotten it. Finn had begun, sometime in those last weeks, to sleep with his hand resting on Scout's back. He did not explain this, and Alara did not ask. Some knowledge arrives before the mind is ready to name it. The body simply responds. His 3 places in the end: the threshold, the warm center of the floor, the foot of Finn's bed. He had not been in pain. He had simply, one morning, settled himself on the warm boards in the center of the floor, the warmest point, directly above the oldest section of the flue, where the stone had absorbed and given back heat for years, and would go on doing so long after everything else had changed, and breathed slowly. And then, between one breath and the next, did not breathe any more. Finn stayed beside him for a long time. He did not need to be told to stay. He simply did not leave. Alara sat in the doorway and let him have the time. She had learned, raising him, that some kinds of grief need the room they need, and the person experiencing them is the only one who knows how much room that is. She sat in the doorway in the autumn light and listened to the leaves come down and let him be. And can you imagine? A dog who came from nowhere, chose them on a cold morning, and stayed for every winter after. Some creatures know exactly what they are for. They buried Scout under the gnarled tree at the edge of the yard, the tree that had been there when they arrived, that had roots deep enough to have found water through the hardest summers, that had watched everything from the beginning with the patient steadiness of something that has existed long enough to understand that most things pass, and most things matter anyway. Finn shaped the marker himself. He worked slowly, with the particular care he brought to things that needed to be done right. The stone was a piece of creek slate, not the original piece, which had long since been written smooth and replaced, but one of the same kind, flat and dark and cooperative under the right tool. He carved the letters even and deliberate. He kept watch so we could sleep. They stood beside the stone for a while without speaking. The 3 of them, Alara and Finn and Silas, who had been part of the family long enough now that his presence at moments like this required no explanation. Then Finn said, "He was a good dog." "Yes," Alara said. "He knew what he was for." She put her arm around Finn's shoulders. He was taller than her, had been for years, but he still fit under her arm in the way that people fit who have been close since the beginning, whose shapes have learned each other. "He always did," she said. Finn carried the knowledge farther than the valley in the end. He was not a man who explained things easily. He had his mother's economy with words, her preference for demonstration over description, but he understood the principles at a depth that made him able to adapt them. Different soils, different climates, different building materials. The core was always the same. Do not fight the cold. Do not try to overpower it. Build the warmth into the mass of the thing itself, and the thing will hold it, and release it slowly, and the people inside will be warm long after the fire is out. He became known in the wider world beyond the valley as a man who solved problems that other builders had declared unsolvable. He was not flashy about this. He did not seek recognition or compensation beyond what the work required. He simply showed up, examined the situation with the focused patience his mother had modeled for him from the age of 8, and began. People remarked on his hands, how he pressed them to surfaces, to floors, to walls, reading warmth and cold the way some people read text. He had learned that from her too, though she had never described it as a lesson. He married a woman named Ruth who understood silence in the same language he did, which is to say, they were very comfortable together. They had 4 children, all of whom grew up knowing the story of the warm house, all of whom could explain the principles of a mass heater before they were 10. The knowledge passed between them the way such knowledge always passes, not through lectures, but through proximity, through watching, through the accumulated understanding that comes from growing up in a home where someone presses their palm to the floor each morning like a prayer. He never called the method his. He called it the Voss method, and when people asked who Voss was, he told them not the whole story, because the whole story took a long time to tell, and most people needed to get home before dark, but enough of it that they understood where the knowledge had come from and what it had cost to keep, and why it mattered that they knew the name. His children knew the whole story. He made sure of that. The cabin itself became known, in the years that followed, simply as the Warm House. No one in the valley still remembered the name Voss's Folly. The name had fallen away the way names do when they are made from mockery, and the thing they mock outlasts the mocker. She was sitting on the porch in the last good light of a mild afternoon when her granddaughter asked. The girl was 7, Finn's youngest, with Finn's quality of stillness when something interested her, and Silas's habit of approaching questions sideways, circling them a few times before landing. She had been inside on the warm floor doing what children do on warm floors, which is to say, existing contentedly, taking the warmth for granted in the absolute way of someone for whom the warmth has always simply been there. She had come outside and climbed up beside her grandmother and sat for a while in the companionable silence of a child comfortable enough with someone to not need to fill the space between them. The yard was quieter than it had been in the early years. The settlement beyond the property line had grown. More rooftops visible through the bare trees, more smoke rising in the evening air, more of the kind of easy, established noise that accumulates when a place has decided to stay. You could not walk through the valley now without passing buildings that had been built with the principles Ilara had dug out of the frozen ground in that first desperate autumn. The warmth had spread the way warmth spreads, not from any single dramatic moment, but steadily, through stone, through earth, through the patient accumulation of one building done right teaching the next. Then the girl had asked, "Grandma, were you really scared when it was just you and Papa at the beginning?" Ilara looked at her. She considered the honest answer, because the girl had asked honestly, and deserved the same in return. She thought about the night she had sat alone in the repaired cabin and calculated, with the cold arithmetic of a woman with no margin for error, what she had and what she needed, and how large the gap between them was. She thought about the morning she had gone out in the dark for bark to bring down a fever and had stood for one moment in the woods completely alone in the cold, and thought, "I do not know if I can do this." She thought about the floor under her feet, then and now, and what it had meant to press her palm to it and feel the warmth rising. Every single day, she said, Her granddaughter was quiet, turning this over. But you did it anyway. Yes. Even when you didn't know if it would work? Ilara thought about the first fire, the hour it burned, clean and small, in the external firebox. The way she had sealed the box afterward and pressed her palm to the floor and felt nothing. Felt only cold boards and the patience required to wait. The next morning, the warmth beginning. Faint, then present, then unmistakable. Especially then, she said. That is usually when it matters most. The girl considered this with a serious expression she brought to things that required serious consideration. What made you keep going? Ilara looked at the yard, at the tree where Scout was buried, with its deep roots and its annual leaves coming and going with the seasons, as they always had, and as they would long after she was gone. At the firebox at the cabin's end, neat and sealed. At the view of the settlement beyond the property line, the roof lines of buildings that had been built on knowledge that had not existed here before one winter changed everything. Your great-grandfather taught me something, she said. He spent his whole life building things that held their warmth against the cold. Not by fighting the cold, by building something strong enough in itself that the cold could not take from it. She looked at the girl. He said, "The fire is temporary. The warmth you build into the stone, that stays." A pause. I tried to do that, Ilara said. With the house, with your father, with everything I had. The girl looked at the cabin, at the warm floor just visible through the open door, where the afternoon light fell in the long gold bar that came through the south window at this hour. "Will you teach me?" she asked. "Everything great-grandfather taught you?" Ilara looked at her granddaughter, at the serious face and the open hands and the uncomplicated willingness of someone who has not yet learned to be cautious about how much they want to know. She thought of Lars Voss in his boatyard, drawing in the air above his workbench. She thought of herself at 7, watching his hands trace the path of heat through stone, taking it in without knowing yet that she was taking it in, storing it in the place where you store the things you will need later. This is how knowledge travels, she thought. Not through proclamation, but through patience. Not through force, but through demonstration. Hand to hand, season to season, generation to generation. The same way warmth moves through stone. Her father had given it to her without knowing exactly when she would need it or what form the needing would take. He had simply given it the way you plant a tree without knowing who will sit in its shade. And she had held it through the years of her marriage, through the grief of his death, through the long, difficult mourning of her life when everything had been stripped away. And there it was, exactly when she needed it, exactly as he had left it, intact, warm, waiting. She was going to give it to this child the same way, not as a lesson, not as a curriculum, simply as something done carefully in her presence, repeated until it became familiar, until it passed between them the way language passes between people who have known each other long enough to share one. "Yes, my darling," she said, "I will teach you everything." The afternoon light held for another hour before it began to soften into evening. The gold bar through the south window moved slowly across the warm floor, as it did each afternoon, at this time, as it had for as long as the window had been there to let it in. The cabin was quiet. The stone beneath the boards held what it had been given in the morning's small fire and gave it back steadily, without fanfare, without requiring anything in return. This was what stone does. This was what it had always done. Outside, under the gnarled tree with the deep roots, a slate marker stood in the ground with 4 words on it that said everything that needed to be said about what it means to stay beside something you love when the world is cold and the darkness is long and the morning is not yet certain. If you are facing your own storm right now, remember her. Remember that warmth is not found in the flame. It is built into the stone. It is built slowly, with patience, with knowledge, with the refusal to stop when the stopping would be easier. Inside, the floor was warm. It had been warm for years, and it would be warm for years after this. And the fire that had built the warmth had been out since morning. The fire is the ceremony. The heat is the gift, and the stone, the patient, faithful, remembering stone, holds the gift long after the ceremony is done, and gives it back slowly, and does not ask to be thanked for it, and does not need to be. It simply warms. It always does. It always will. This is a work of fiction. All characters, events, and locations depicted in this story are entirely imaginary. Any resemblance to real persons, living or deceased, or to actual events, is coincidental and unintended.